And welcome back to the Showrunner. Very excited to be with you for another week of talking about creating remarkable experiences for our audiences. I am your host, Jared Morris, host of the Assembly Call and Podcast on the Brink and Site Success, and the Showrunner, of course. And I'm here with my co-host, Johnny Naster, the host of Hack the Entrepreneur. Johnny, always great to talk to you.
Yeah, it is. It's great. I'm still, I have to say it. I know I've said it, but I'm really enjoying being back.
I agree. All right. So last week we started this series on reassessments, and we talked about, in last week's episode, we talked about reassessing why you're even podcasting in the first place. And, really more than reassessing, hopefully reaffirming why you are running a podcast in the first place. And so if you missed that episode, definitely go back and check that out. A lot of good stuff in there. And this week we're going to continue along, and we're going to talk about podcast positioning. So, reassessing, reviewing how you are positioning your podcast, because you can change, your audience can change and evolve, the market can change and evolve. All of these things can happen in between when you launch your show and where you are right now. Positioning is not just a set it and forget it type thing. And if you are still in the stage where you haven't launched a podcast yet, then you're going to be coming to this episode and coming to the question of positioning from a bit more of a fresh perspective. And that's fine, because what you're going to learn in this episode will still give you some overview information that will help you make smart decisions for positioning from the beginning. But then, down the line sometime, you're going to want to reassess and review that as well. Because as we mentioned in the last episode, Johnny, is we're talking about these reassessments. The worst thing that can happen when you do this, when you review, your why, when you review your goals, when you review your positioning, when you review the other things that we're going to talk about, is you just reaffirm what you already have. So if it's the best process, if it's the best goal, if it's the best positioning that you could have, then great. You've reaffirmed it. You're ready to move forward with confidence. And if not, you're able to make tweaks, make changes that are going to help you moving forward. So we're going to spend some time in this episode talking about what positioning is. We're going to talk about the 3-step process, Johnny, that you and I came up with a while back and still like and use for constructing a unique podcast that will attract and retain an audience. And then we have some exciting news about some additional resources that people can get if they want to dive in more on this topic of positioning. But before we dive into that, any thoughts from you just on, as you reflect on last week's episode, or as we plow forward and move ahead here talking about positioning?
I'm going to have to say, no, not too much. I like the order that we're going in at this point, which we kind of tweaked at the very last moment. And I like the emphasis on the worst that can happen is that you're just reaffirming it. So we're not telling you that you have to find something here to make you pivot and completely change your direction. That's not at all the goal. It's just really making you sort of step back out of your work and getting that bird's eye view each time and make sure that the direction you're heading is correct. So yeah, I'm ready for this.
Cool. Well, let's do it. Let's hop in and talk about positioning. And I suppose that we should start from the most basic place that we can start from for this discussion. And we don't want to assume that everybody is on the same page. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page. And so let's just discuss briefly what positioning is. And this is very fresh in my mind, Johnny, because you and I talked about this yesterday, but I was doing one of the first lessons for this course that we are putting together about positioning, because we really want to demystify this, give people a step-by-step process that you can go through to make sure that you're making smart decisions about your positioning. And in that course I go through a very detailed definition of what it is, and I'll sum that definition up here in just a second. But to you, when I say positioning, and specifically when I say podcast positioning, what does that mean to you?
It means, to me, it sort of means the way that your audience, or in this case, I guess, prospective audience, somebody who might find you, the way they're going to see you and what your show can do for them. So, I mean, from the business world, usually when you create a new product or a new service, you put it out into the world, and typically it doesn't just take off. It doesn't mean that your product or service is no good. It doesn't mean that you're not solving a real problem. It usually just means that your positioning is off and you're just not showing it to the audience in the right way. And so there are thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasts that are so damn good on like iTunes, on Spotify. Like, just if you just dive deep sometimes, just go way down to bottoms of lists and places you can, and just randomly play something. It's like, man, she's making something amazing. Like, it sounds so good. She's so into it. She can speak way better than I can. She, like, you know what I mean? The content's there. It's just not positioned right to actually get noticed and to make it effective. And so to me, it really is that it's not, again, thinking that maybe your show is wrong. It's just positioning allows you to, or enables you to, sort of put yourself in the prospective audience's shoes, and then make sure that you position yourself accordingly to help them, or at least intrigue them to want to listen.
Yeah, your positioning is what distinguishes you and your show. It's what makes it stand out. It's what is going to attract people to pay attention to it, to give it a listen. And I think sometimes we think about positioning and our thoughts about it maybe stop there, that your positioning, that distinguishing feature, it's going to get you that first listen. But the way that your show is positioned is also going to help you retain audience members. It's also going to help you earn subscribers, earn the conversions that you're looking for. And, this is all stuff that we're going to talk about here and that we go in depth on in the course. But that's what positioning is. And the reason why it is so important, and why it gets more important by the day as more shows come out and more episodes are out there, and there is more and more competition for the ear share of the audience, the potential audience that you're going after, is, you have to separate yourself. You have to distinguish yourself from all of the other options out there. And you have to communicate effectively what makes you unique and what makes you irreplaceable, because that will get you the initial listen, and it's what will keep people coming back. And there are many, 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 many facets of positioning. There's so many different elements that go into it. It's not one thing. It's not just having your show art look a certain way. It's not just your format. It's the entire amalgamation of elements of your show that can help create that positioning. But it's not something that you want to leave to chance. It's something that you want to be strategic about. And again, as we talked about in this, as we're talking about in this episode, something that you want to constantly reassess and reaffirm just in case anything changes. So that's positioning, the distinguishing features of your show that are going to make people take notice, because they are able to look at your show and see clearly how it is different from the other options that are out there. So it's not just, all right, well, here's, just this whole group of shows over here, and I don't really know why I'd listen to any of them because they're all the same. It's, okay, there's, this show that, oh, wow, look at this show. And this show is about X, and the transformation they're going to help me make is this. And there's those distinguishing features that make it stand out. And so that's the key point that we want to drive home in this episode more than anything else is, if you haven't thought about this, and if you can't clearly articulate what your positioning is and what the distinguishing features of your show are, then you're really going to be behind the 8 ball when it comes to building the kind of audience that you want. So make sure this is something that you're being intentional about. And if it is something that you've been intentional about all along, maybe use this as an impetus for reassessing that and hopefully reaffirming what it already was. But even if not, being able to make the subtle tweaks that will help ensure that you have a distinguished show moving forward. Now, Johnny, you and I recently went through this exercise for the Showrunner. We did it when we launched the Showrunner. It's something that we were, specific about, that we were strategic about. And I think we have, reassessed it at times, but probably never with the level of granularity that we did it with this last time. We kind of came back and redesigned the website and brought the show back. We really, did a thorough reassessment of where we were positioning ourselves, our show in the market of other podcasts about podcasting. And so as we go through talking about this 3-step process that we came up with for constructing a unique podcast that is going to help folks attract and retain an audience, we can use the Showrunner as an example. for, kind of how you do a reassessment and how you, can subtly shift in different ways as your interest shifts, as maybe the knowledge and experience that you bring to the table shifts, as the market shifts, all those different factors that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we're talking about here, I guess people sort of positioning it before they have a show. And then from our perspective with the example, it's a show that's been around for 2.5 years. And I bet people listening that listened before the break and listened after the break haven't necessarily noticed a quote unquote change in the show. But there's been a huge shift for us in positioning of the show, which I guess takes me back to that whole product. The product maybe is great, but it just not like resonating with your audience. So you just change the positioning. And ours wasn't so much that it wasn't resonating with the audience. It's just, we wanted to sort of move audiences slightly or else encompass another one in that sort of fold. So we repositioned it with that in mind, not so much just to like get more of the same audience. It was actually to bring other people into it, so we could sort of move up in the services and things we were offering from the showrunner.
Yeah, and I think to your point, we're going to talk about differentiation and then kind of displaying and doubling down on your differentiation as we move forward. That probably hasn't come out quite yet in the podcast, but I think it will as we move forward with more episodes. So that'll be kind of an interesting evolution to watch as we go forward. But let's talk about this 3-step process. And it's very simple. We did an episode about this a while back. I don't remember what number it is off the top of my head, but I'll link to it in the show notes. And we called it the 3D process for constructing a unique podcast. And it was decide, differentiate, and then display and double down. So let's go through each one of those. So when we're talking about positioning and when we're talking about distinguishing your show, deciding is the first step. You have to make your show could be about everything, right? I mean, there's endless topics. So the first thing that you have to decide on is, okay, what am I going to talk about? And look, there are some people that just have conversational shows, and I've talked with these people at, Podcast Dallas meetups, and they want to get on and just have a conversational show. It's like, okay, well, what's the show about? Well, just kind of everything. We'll talk about pop culture, we'll talk about politics, we'll talk about sports. And that's fine. Look, there's still a way to differentiate a show like that, because you can differentiate with your personality. You could differentiate with your, with your format, with different things. But that first decision is you've got to decide what you're going to talk about. So for the assembly call, we decided we're going to talk about Indiana basketball. I had done a podcast previously, kind of a more general sports podcast on MidwestSportsFans.com. I made a decision that I wanted to focus more on just IU basketball. That decision right there helped position this show, because it determined who the audience was going to be, what the topic of the show is going to be. With site success, for example, that decision was made. This is going to be a show for WordPress owners. So we're going to teach people how to build a successful website, but specifically WordPress owners. Johnny, when you came up with Hack the Entrepreneur, you've told this story before. I don't remember what decision came first, but at some point, you had to decide if you're going to do an interview show, okay, who are you going to interview? What is this show going to be about? And you, of course, decided that it was going to be about entrepreneurship. And so the same thing is true here for what we're doing with the Showrunner. So, we had to decide what the show was going to be about when it came to talking about podcasting. And we've always thought, our bread and butter isn't talking as much about the technology aspects of it and getting 100% great quality audio, that kind of thing. We, in the beginning, were much more about creating a remarkable experience for an audience. And, now as we've gone through a little bit, this positioning exercise and thought a little bit more about, how we want to distinguish ourselves and position ourselves in the market, it's talking even more about not just how to create a great podcast, but how to create an overall experience where a podcast is at the center of it. So I think, Johnny, you and I realized that, we were talking a lot about how to build an email list. And we were talking about things like, doing live video and some other different elements that our experience gave us expertise to talk about more. And now we want to bring these more officially into what we're talking about with the Showrunner. And so that's why, now when you look at our website and you look at the headline, drive meaningful results with a podcast centered content strategy, this is not just a podcast about podcasting. It's a podcast about, yes, having a podcast, having a show as the center of your content strategy, but the other elements around it that accentuate that experience and give your audience even more. And so we had to make that decision that we wanted to bring that stuff in more holistically. And that's what we want to do. And that's a positioning decision because there are lots of podcasts out there about podcasting, but not necessarily podcasts that we have seen that are talking about it the way that we are in terms of a podcast centered content strategy.
So let me be clear or get clear on this. The deciding stage, this first stage, is because it seemed like in lots of that, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you maybe went down to differentiating already. Like you used me as an example and said like Hack the Entrepreneur, interview-based show about entrepreneurship. That's not my positioning, right? I decided to do that show, but there was still another key step of the differentiation that was my positioning, right? Us doing a show about podcasting is kind of like, yeah, that's what we wanted to do, but then we decided to do that. And so you have to decide to do that, but it's kind of like picturing like a funnel, and at the top you're deciding, but before you can get through the bottom, you have to differentiate and just have that sort of smaller stream coming out the bottom. Otherwise it just won't work.
Yeah, I mean, these three steps do kind of bleed into each other a little bit.
Yeah,
so
okay.
There's no question about that. But that's got to be that first step, is really making a clear decision about what you're going to talk about and who the audience is that you're going to serve. I think, and we talked about that in the last episode, how fundamental that is. And so that is still important here. And you do differentiate, you do position yourself based on what you're going to talk about, who you're going to talk about it to. And that's the basic point that we're driving home here with Decide. Now, as we get into talking about differentiation, now you're going to take, what you're going to talk about and who you're going to talk about it to, and you're going to differentiate from that point. And there are so many different ways that you can do that. You can do it with format. You can do it with the frequency that, that you're going to do it with. So they're on and on. There's so many different ways here that you can do this. And this is where having a firm understanding of the market that you're stepping into and the audience that you're going to serve and what they're already seeing, this is where it's so important to have that understanding so that okay, this is out there, this is out there, this is out there, but this isn't out there. And this is a place where we can position ourselves so that we can get attention, because people may be seeing this topic discussed, but they're not seeing it discussed in this way. So you look at it, for the showrunner, and we've tried to differentiate ourselves, as I mentioned, this mentality of thinking beyond just the podcast, treating it as a show in kind of the more traditional, especially the television sense of the term. That was in the beginning how we wanted to differentiate talking about podcasting. Our own unique experiences that we're able to bring into this, Johnny, you with interviews, me with live broadcasts that I've done, having shows that are on the radio, those experiences help to differentiate what we're talking about, because no one else has those experiences. We have a show with two hosts, so our chemistry is a way that we can differentiate this. And how many times have we had people tell us, Johnny, about how they like hearing us talk because there's a chemistry there? That's a way that you can differentiate your show. And then I think also, for us, we want to differentiate by our willingness to lead through example and experimentation. So lead from out in front and, kind of do things, try things out, bring back the results here to show you and give you ideas for what you can do. So, and there are other ways. I don't think we necessarily differentiate the showrunner with our format. We have a pretty standard format. We've tried some things in the past, and they haven't necessarily stuck, and we'll probably try things in the future, but we're not differentiating through having much better audio quality or through the music we choose or through sound effects or like anything else. We really have a content focused and personality, chemistry, experience focused differentiation that we're bringing to the table.
And again, this is like 32 months, something like that down the line for us. And although we started with differentiation, we didn't start with nearly all of this.
Right.
Like I remember we hadn't even met when we started. We were brought together by Brian Clark, right? And I mean, he used like our own experiences that you say, like the interviews, the live broadcast. Like he saw us separately and saw like this will be good, and then brought us together, and the chemistry works and all that stuff. But we didn't know that at the time as a differentiator. Now we can sort of emphasize it because you learn these things with time. But I remember us having this conversation, and immediately the key differentiator that we knew we could run with was, because there's a lot of shows about podcasting, we were like, we're going to be the non-technical podcasters. We're going to talk more about sort of the ideas behind it, sort of the bigger picture, more even like the mindset, but then also strategizing it rather than like, here's how to edit a show. And because we saw that was out there, and we went a different way because it identified with us. And so I guess I just wanted to clarify, because obviously sometimes people, they're listening, and although it's been 2 or 3 years for us, those timelines seem kind of condensed, and it's almost like we just started here. And we didn't, right? We had to sort of reassess as we went and reassess. Then you hear that feedback about how it works, and it's like, okay, we can differentiate even more by doing that. But you don't necessarily need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 differentiators to start. You need a key one, though. And we really had one that we were both, this totally separates us from everyone else, and it's 100% congruent with who we are and what we know.
Yeah. And the greatest example of differentiation that I have experienced in my own podcasting, it's an example that I've used often, is the assembly call. We were entering a market for Indiana basketball content that already had a lot of people in there. There wasn't a ton of podcasting, but there was a lot of other content out there. When you're creating a show, you are competing with other podcasts in your niche, but you're also competing with podcasts generally. And you're even competing in a more broad sense with just general online content, because people only have a specific amount of time that they can invest in this. And we knew our audience only had a specific amount of time to invest in, learning about their Hoosiers. And so that's why we decided the one thing that wasn't out there was a live show right after a game. And so that was our biggest differentiator. And it is the reason why we built an audience, because there was a certain amount of people that, whether they knew it or not, there was a demand for content at that time. We filled it. And as the only one out there, we attracted attention. And because we were good enough at creating the content, we were able to retain some of that attention. And now here we are 7 years later. So, we're giving you these examples, from our experience and certainly from the Showrunner, to kind of talk through some of the thought processes that we went through. And the goal here is not just for you to understand what we were thinking when we did this and what we're thinking as we reassess it. It's to hopefully push you in the direction of thinking about these things yourself. And if you notice as we talk about this stuff that these aren't thought processes that you've had, or that you wouldn't be able to explain this or explain your differentiation, then this is really something that you need to sit down and think about. So that's the goal here. That's why we're doing this. And I'll tell you the other reason why we're doing it specifically, talking so much about the positioning for the Showrunner, and it leads in to the third step in this process for creating a unique podcast, and that is to display and double down on it. So it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to think about our positioning and understand our positioning and know our positioning if we're not communicating it, if we're not displaying it, and if we're not really doubling down on it. You don't want to feel apologetic for your positioning, like it needs to be something that you're confident in and that you shout from the tops of the hills to every potential audience member who can hear you. That's the whole idea, because you want it to distinguish you. So displaying and doubling down, once you've decided what your show is going to be about and you've figured out how to differentiate it, now you've got to display it and double down. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. For us, the way that we're doing it with the Showrunner is talking about it here out in the open on the podcast, so you know exactly where we're coming from. Our new website and the new headline and tagline that we have on there, when you go to showrunner.fm, that's a way of doing it. We just created a new email sequence. That's a way of doing it. A lot of the education that we're going to start doing through our main course and through some mini courses that we have coming out, that's another way that we're going to do it. The community, the kind of enhanced community that we're eventually going to have, coming down the line, That's another way. Getting back to doing Q&As and live broadcasts. All of these things are ways that we are going to display and double down on this positioning. And the other element of this that we haven't really discussed yet is there's really two elements, and you'll see them if you go to the headline. And this is something, Johnny, that I think is really important for people to think about when you think about your positioning, is you want to think about what the transformation is that you want your audience to have, because this is a way that you can differentiate yourself. And you should always be thinking about this. This is just a fundamental thought that you should have about your show, not just specific to positioning, but what's the transformation? And Johnny, you and I are very specific that we want to help people drive meaningful results. So it's not just anymore about creating a remarkable audience experience. It's not just about, build a connection with your audience, with your listeners. That is a means to an end. The end is driving meaningful results. Now, it's a little bit hard to get more specific than that because meaningful results can be different to different people. For some people, it might be money. For some people, it might be they need to sell sponsorships on their podcast. For other people, they may be, wanting to sell courses. They may be wanting to sign up people for their services, or they may just be a hobby podcaster that wants the satisfaction of a lot of downloads. But for whatever that person is, there is a meaningful result that they're looking for. We want to help them drive that meaningful result with a podcast-centered content strategy. And I think crystallizing that helps us understand more specifically what it is our goal is, and helps our audience understand what they should be getting out of each of these episodes. That is going to help in terms of differentiation and positioning, because there's no question where we're trying to help lead people.
Okay, so again, I'm going to preface it by, correct me if I'm wrong. This is just the way my brain works, and I'm going to trust that I'm not totally unique, and that there's probably other people out there listening that might think in the same way. And I've come up with a little bit of a tiny framework. And so each of these 3 steps are done after sort of that reaffirming that you're heading in the right direction, right? The episode before. And if you missed that, go back and listen to it, because that prefaces this whole exercise. But to me, I like to know sort of what it should take for me to do this. And I think each of these 3Ds don't need to follow consecutively after each other. But here's how I sort of have worked it out in my brain as you were discussing this. Deciding, once you know and you've reaffirmed, deciding what it's going to be about should take you maybe 2 days to do, right? Maybe don't make the decision on the first day, maybe sleep on it, and then the next day you should know and be able to decide that my show's about podcasting, my show's about Indiana basketball, my show, something like that. You should be able to decide.
And if you're in the reassessment phase, it may take you 30 seconds because you're going to stick with the topic. You can skip right ahead to the next thing.
I guess this should be like the top end of it. If you're at the end of 2 days, don't put it off for 2 weeks. Yeah. And then again, this doesn't have to follow the next day, but the differentiation process to me should take maybe 2 weeks. Like before you start recording, give yourself 2 weeks. You've come up with what you're going to talk about. You've decided, but now it's so crucial that you differentiate that you should spend that couple of weeks asking people who could be in your market, ask friends, ask anybody you can or trust to get feedback and say, like, is this interesting? Would this, and check out your marketplace, who you're going to be competing with, and make sure that you have that differentiator. I actually spent more than that time with Hack the Entrepreneur because I knew that it was crucial to hitting in a market that was already really saturated. And then once you're done that 2-week phase, again, you can launch your show at this point and tweak it as you go, differentiate more. But then the whole displaying and doubling down process, I would say give it like 2 months. It takes always longer to really change your website, do those things that you want. It always seems like it's going to be quick, but to me, if it starts taking longer than that, again, you're spending too much time on it. But to me, it would be the whole 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. And if you can use that sort of as a framework, it's going to kind of keep you on track and know if you're heading in the right direction or if you need to sort of pull back and like get yourself back on track.
That's
if
smart.
you get lost in these, I would go back to the episode before because I think you've maybe missed something we talked about in that reaffirming stage.
Yeah, I like that framework a lot. And I think the interesting part about displaying and doubling down is I think 2 months is, kind of fine for getting it in kind of to the infrastructure of what you do, but it's not something that ever ends.
No, 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 no.
That's definitely not something that ever stops, because you want, at every opportunity, you want to be a living embodiment of your positioning. That's the other thing. It's like for the assembly call, part of our positioning was, we're not going to be dwelling on the negatives and, calling players out and calling names and, calling the coach a clown and making fun of him for how he hikes up his pants and this other stuff that people used to talk about in the cesspools of IU conversation. We weren't going to do that. So every episode where we didn't do that or shut down a commenter when they tried to do that, that is part of displaying and doubling down on your positioning, on your differentiation. So it's important to keep that in mind. I totally agree with you, to get the big infrastructure stuff in place. Give yourself that 2 months, but then never forget that you've constantly got to be putting that out there, not shying away from it.
Of course. It also, I think, gives a good timeline for, say, you talked about, say, like more robust live broadcasts and Q&As. Say somebody who was thinking of that would be a great differentiator. They want to double down on that. You should at least set that up and do it for 2 months before maybe deciding that it's not right for you, because these things do take time to get traction. So if you want to use the 2 months in that sense, to me, that's a good timeline to kind of make sure you've given it enough and you've really have actually doubled down. You haven't just sort of dipped your toe in the doubling down waters. So use that how you want. And obviously it's flexible and it is an ongoing process, but I would take it maybe the 2 months on a project by project sort of basis. Like, I'm going to redo my email funnels, or I'm going to redo my website. Each of those would take you 2 months.
Yeah. And then the last element that I want to discuss here, and I don't know exactly where this, fits into this 3-step process, but I think it's important, and really part of it comes back to what we talked about last episode. But I think understanding how you want to position your relationship with the audience is important. So, if you look at our website right now, Johnny, I talked about the headline, Drive Meaningful Results with a Podcast-Centered Strategy. And then you look at the first line of our description under that, veteran podcasters Jared Morris and John Naster are your virtual podcasting mentors, showing you by explanation and example how to run a show that develops a deep audience connection and drives results that really matter. We've talked about pretty much all the elements in there except for virtual podcasting mentors. And we had a nice long Slack chat where we kind of, debated, different terms. Should we be mentors? Should we be coaches? Why be a mentor? And I think it's important. So it's like, for example, on the assembly call, we're not a coach, we're not a mentor. We are entertainers and kind of educators. We want to educate people about the game, but really it's more entertainment. And even more than that, it's, I think, kind of community leaders in a sense on that show. That's important to understand. On Site Success, where it's just a monologue show and I'm not really interacting that much with the audience, it's, very strictly just kind of an educator relationship. I'm putting out educational content. I want people to learn from it, but I understand that I'm not necessarily going to be working one-on-one, answering a lot of follow-up questions, that kind of thing. So it's clear in my head what it is. And I think for you and me, the way that we want this to work with the Showrunner is we want to be mentors. And the reason why we chose mentor and not coach is, to me, when I think of a mentor, I think of someone who is still in the trenches doing it, but at the same time working with other people who just have a little bit less experience, but kind of leading by example, sharing experience, trying to pull other people up to where we are, but at the same time learning from them and applying what we're learning to what we're out there doing. So there is kind of some two-way learning going on. We're just a little bit further along. To me, coach more can be someone who was in the game, but maybe is now out of the game and teaching people who are up and coming. To me, that's where I kind of differentiate those two terms. I know that's not always the case, and I'm thinking about it much more kind of in a sports context than maybe what it is in the online world. But that's why we went with mentor over coaches. And I think splitting the hairs like that and really thinking about it and getting into the nitty-gritty of it is a worthwhile exercise to go through, because when you really understand how you want your relationship with the audience positioned, you can make sure that every move you make, every step you take is going to be leading toward that, so that the audience sees you in that light. And that's going to help you move forward, creating the kind of relationship that you want, which will help you get the meaningful results that you want, which is kind of get back to the big goal. That's what we're trying to push everybody toward here with this show. So I think that's, and again, I don't know exactly where that goes, but I think as you think about your positioning, really defining for yourself and then making sure that your audience understands how that relationship is, I think, is important. What do you think?
I agree. Part 2. I like it. Right? Part 2 of 3? Is there a third part to this series?
Yeah, no, there's 4 parts to the series.
Oh, there's 4 parts to this series.
Yeah, there's 4 parts.
Ooh,
we have no, there's more reassessment coming. We're going to have an episode coming up with Toby from 24 Sound, because we're going to be talking about reassessing kind of your post-production process, your audio, reassessing your audio quality, because that's important. I mean, it's not something that we dive into too much, but you got to make sure you have that minimum standard, and you want to make sure that your processes are as efficient as possible. So we're going to be talking about that with Toby, and then before that, although we haven't figured out the exact order of those episodes, but we're also just going to reassess the experience that you're delivering to your audience. So once you've reaffirmed why you're podcasting in the first place and you understand your positioning, now you want to look at all the different elements of your experience, the experience that you're giving. And this is where you get into things beyond just the podcast content, but the email and, live events, but just what is the experience with you and your show? It's always good to reassess that as well. So we're going to be talking about that too.
So in complete transparency, you had completely caught me off guard with that last question, obviously, because like 30 seconds before that, you said every move you make, every step you take.
Right as I said that,
all I was hearing was the police song the whole time. You looked at me and I was like, okay, get rid of the police song. The order you said it, the way you said it, I was like, wow, he's just going to carry on. But sorry.
Once the word, I did not do it intentionally, but once the words got out of my mouth, I did recognize that.
And my brain just thought it was gone.
So here's the other thing that I want to tell people about. So we have just very briefly touched on it in this episode, this idea of positioning, but we're going in depth on it. And this is one of the new courses that we're putting together right now. I actually as I mentioned, I just recorded one of the lessons yesterday. I'm going to be recording more of them as we go through here. I'm going to give you a URL. It's showrunner.fm/podcast-positioning. We'll probably have a cleaner URL at some point. But that URL, as I'm speaking this, as we're recording this episode, there's really nothing at that URL, but that is where information for the course will be by the time this episode comes out. I'm doing this in part because it'll give me a deadline, and that'll make sure that we get this ready to go. I just little peel back the curtain a little bit. I work much better when I have deadlines, and so giving myself a public deadline is a good way to make sure that things get done. So I'm putting that out there. By the time you listen to this episode, you should be able to go there, find out information about that course, so that if you want to dive in more and really dive into the nitty-gritty about podcast positioning, what it is, the specific ways to do it. We didn't really talk too much about that. We talked about our shows. What you care about is your show. And this course is going to help walk you through step by step how to differentiate your show, and then talk about it with other people. It'll give me a chance, to maybe answer some of your questions about it as well. So we're putting that course together right now. We're excited about it. Obviously, people who, get in the beginning when we first put that course out there are going to get the absolute best price, the best value, all those things. So we'll be talking about that more in upcoming episodes, but just know that should be out and ready to go for you to check out by the time this episode comes out. So go to showrunner.fm/podcast-positioning if what we've talked about in this episode has piqued your interest and you're ready to really dive in and make sure that you've distinguished your show as much as possible. Because if you haven't, you're just costing yourself attraction and retention, and there's no reason to do that. If you're putting in the effort to produce a show, you want to make sure it's positioned as well as possible so you can maximize that effort. And that's what we're going to teach you how to do in this course.
I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. All right. Any final thoughts here, Johnny, before we sign off?
No, I think we're good. We're, again, for the last few episodes and moving forward, we're trying to keep these tighter and more action oriented for people. So I think we should wrap this one up and prepare for next week.
Let's do it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And we will talk to you next week on another brand new episode of The Showrunner.
Take care.